you everybody for coming. Good morning. Thanks for coming to this panel session where we will be discussing Australia's future capability in both the space and the spatial industries in Australia. My name is Phil Delaney. I'm standing in for Peter Woodgate, who unfortunately is unable to travel at the moment. So I manage research investment as well as partner services for the Cooperative Research Centre for Spatial Information. We sit in between the private sector, universities and government departments to bring research ideas through to real-world products and services in the downstream storage and analysis of space-based data. Before we start the panel, I'd like to present briefly on a 10-year growth agenda developed by the geospatial industry in Australia over the last year and frame that plan in context of the broader space industry. After I do that, we will then have a panel session. And during that session, we're open to questions from the audience, but if you can put up your hand to flag down a volunteer, you can write down your question and pass that up to me up at the front. So to paraphrase something from our Prime Minister here, there's never been a more exciting time to be part of Australian space or spatial industries at the moment. The buzz here this week is evidence of that. The growth in new space technologies and businesses, the policy frameworks are all really conducive to growth. And of course, the new Space Agency provides further impetus for us to be growing the industry here. However, you may have noticed that here and in the presentation I've been referring to space and spatial as two different industries. And that's because at the moment in Australia, the supply chain to create space-based data is generally segmented into two completely separate industries. They each have their own industry associations, they each have their own conferences, and there's actually not a whole lot of interaction day to day between the downstream design, build, launch and operate of the systems for the download, storage, analysis, and then out to the end user. So this is something that we'd like to see change because we think that a proper integration to bring the end user requirements all the way back through to the design phase of all space-based assets is the best opportunity for Australia to grow its space and spatial capabilities over the coming years. And the policy frameworks we think are ripe for that right at the moment. We have a really strong focus on space, spatial and innovation more broadly in a policy context at the moment, starting with the release of the Innovation and Science Agenda 2 years ago, but now more specifically through activities through Innovation and Science Australia, who is an independent statutory authority that was established last year to develop a 15-year rolling innovation and science strategy for the country, as well as the activities that are happening with the Space Activities Act reform, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And of course, I made this presentation before the announcements this week, but now that we have this Space Agency, that provides further policy and national support and focus on space as an industry. So with all this potential sitting here, we were actually surprised to find that when we went out to do a survey last year, that 95% of the leaders that we talked to across the spatial sector in the economy believe that either we're not achieving, that we're either not growing or that the growth that the sector is seeing is being captured by many other interests, including a lot of international players that are capturing all the growth potential within the Australian economy. So we dug into that a little bit more to try and uncover the reasons behind that, and it really fell broadly into three main categories, and I think this is probably extends across the space sector as well, is that, so primarily one of our biggest problems is around messaging. This includes branding and language. We're really not that great in communicating the value and the outcomes that we actually produce back to the economy. Then we're also quite insular industries. We're really great at talking to people that already know about what we do and highlighting the great things that we've done to other people that already know about space and spatial technologies, but we're not that great in turning outwards and then translating that value out to other people. And so while we're actually really good at talking to each other, we're not that great at working together. Australia is at the bottom of the OECD when it comes to engagement between research and the private sector. So yes, while there's a lot of talk, there's not a whole lot of action between the different sectors of these industries. And finally, surprisingly, most of our businesses are actually behind the technology development cycle. This is not to say that we don't develop great technology, because that's core to what we all do. But in terms of how we adapt to the broader technology landscape in a business context, what we generally do is modify technology to meet our existing business practices, rather than looking at the evolving technology landscape to work out how we can actually change and better how we do business. So to address some of these problems, a group of influential agencies across Australia came together to form a group with the aim of creating a 10-year action plan to transform the way in which these industries operate within Australia, to better evolve our businesses and our academic and government organisations, and to really capture some of that global growth potential that we see both in the geospatial data product end, but also in the broader space industry. So this working party was really more about coordination and governance, not providing the direct ideas. Those we generated through a national consultation process. So I was lucky enough to lead a small team under the guidance of this working party to run a national consultation where we interviewed quite a number of leaders from within the spatial industry, but also an equal number from key growth sectors of the Australian economy. We then ran a national series of workshops, as well as a range of online engagements, all of which managed to produce well over 100 actionable ideas that could, in a concrete way and measurable way, improve the industry within Australia. That resulted in 3 key outputs. One is an insights report, which outlines what we think the problems are and what the barriers to growth are. An ideas paper, which was put out as a precursor to the National Leadership Forum series to seed ideas and get people's responses. And then finally, the action plan, which we released in April this year, and that had a foreword by Minister Angus Taylor, the Minister for Digital Transformation. So the 2026 agenda process itself yielded this action plan, which is formed of 6 broad pillars of activity and concern, 8 priority industry sectors that we think are the focus for our growth, and 34 key initiatives that we think will help to transform the industry across Australia. The 6 pillars have been designed to help coordinate the priority initiatives, some of which are already well underway. We're about 6 months after the release of this plan now. And so in a broad sense, those overarching priorities are to have a continued focus on public data infrastructure and public analytics, to clearly define what infrastructure is going to be out there for the private sector to be able to innovate on in the future without confusing the investment that they're doing to duplicate similar capability. We have actions required to encourage and more better leverage the innovative minds and skills that we have across the country and really grow into new markets. We have actions to improve how we communicate the value that is delivered by our sectors to the broader Australian economy, but also to the world. We have actions to optimise the outputs of our research and development activities, both in the key research and university institutions, but also across government and the private sector. Improving the ability of our educational system to deliver space and spatial literacy and make sure that we have the right workforce staffed to keep this industry growing in the future. And actions to clarify and unify and potentially streamline the many industry bodies that are out there representing the different factions and sectors within the broader space and spatial communities in Australia. So, recognising the growth potential of these industries, we've identified 8 key industries for priority attention. What we are using these for is to say we don't want to invest in technology for technology's sake. We, as industries within Australia, are only going to grow through the success of others. We need to identify the priority sectors of the economy that are going to be growing and that there is going to be a lot of investment into. And we need to look at how we help those sectors to grow, because if we can make them grow and we can become critical to that growth, then we will grow as a result. I'd now like to highlight a few of the key actions. We have 34 of them. I'm only going to highlight a few of them that I think are particularly relevant to closing that gap between the space and spatial industries within Australia. And a key one that was in there was about revitalising a bid around a space and spatial growth centre. This was an approved national growth centre in about 2013. Unfortunately, the priorities at a national level as to which industries were seen to be of highest national importance changed a little bit, so this initiative at the time wasn't funded. But I think now, with the creation of the Space Agency, this may provide the catalyst and possibly the vehicle to drive the coordination of investment to grow capability and skills across Australia in both the downstream space infrastructure and also the upstream space infrastructure and the downstream storage, analysis and use of the data that comes from space-based assets. Another key initiative is really our focus on public infrastructure and analytics. This is underpinned by the creation of a national infrastructure roadmap, which clearly outlines the priorities for national infrastructure and how that can best be used to facilitate private sector growth. So to touch on a few key ones in here, we have the national positioning infrastructure, which is a way in which Australia can leverage our unique position in the world as being one of the only countries that sees not only all the global navigation satellites, but also a lot of the regional ones, for example, Japan's QZSS system, and turn that into a national capability which will provide up to, down to 2 centimetre accuracy on any device outside anywhere in the country. Some of you who were part of the previous session would have heard Stuart talk about the Data Cube, which is now Digital Earth Australia, which is really about how we best go about storing and time enabling all of the fantastic continent-wide satellite imagery products that we have out there, as well as then supporting that by creating fundamental data frameworks so that all states across the country produce data in a consistent way, and that we model the movement of the Earth that sits underneath this so that all of the dynamic movement within the Earth's tectonic plates are taken into account for all the mapping products that are created from space-based assets. So we released that about 6 months ago. Since then, we've had some great progress on the NPI. We've seen the Australian and New Zealand governments come together to collaboratively invest $14 million over the next 2 years to create a satellite-based augmentation system, which will be a satellite that sits over the Australia-Pacific region that broadcasts corrections to many of the navigation satellites that are out there, that in alignment with America and Europe will bring down the accuracy of positioning signals down to the sub-metre level. And that capability to read that signal is actually in most phones these days as well. And then as of next week, we'll actually be testing a world first, which is then bringing on a new band to that augmentation system, which should bring the accuracy down to as low as 5 or 10 centimetres. The Digital Earth Australia initiative managed to get over $15 million over the next 2 years to establish and create an operational infrastructure for Digital Earth Australia. And then the focus after that is really about how that system then becomes an enabler for private sector innovation. And in terms of the creation of the roadmap that underpins this, the government released a location intelligence knowledge platform, which really helps to link the end user requirements across the country to the data and infrastructure services for storing space-based data that are out there to make sure that the investment that we make is really well tied to end user needs. So the Working Party's job is done and in creating the agenda, and now we need to work out how we go about implementing it. And so to do that, we have tried to practice what we preach and stop talking to ourselves, and we've broadened out the leadership group that is going to run and apply this agenda so that it includes many key representatives from some of those key growth sectors that we've identified, including intelligent transport systems, including a couple of great representatives from the health sector, including Michelle Allen, who, as well as being the chair of the board for Meat and Livestock Australia and the broader Rural Development Corporations, also sits on the board of Innovation and Science Australia, as well as the Prime Minister's Innovation Advisory Council, as well as areas out through energy and broader innovation. So with that, I'll finish talking about this agenda that might frame some of the discussion that we're about to have. Again, I'll invite everybody to check out the website where we've published this agenda to see how your organisations can take ownership over some of the initiatives that are in there to make sure that you capture some of the potential that is out there. And then to remind you that if you have any questions about this, particularly for our panel members, to raise your hand and attract one of the volunteers out there who'll be happy to have your question written down and passed up to the panel members. So with that, I'll actually move into the panel discussion, where we're going to talk about this agenda, but also more broadly about the requirements to improve both the space and spatial capabilities within Australia over the next 10 years or so. So I'd like to introduce our panel members. So joining us up on stage, we have Andrea Boyd, the Flight Operations Engineer for the International Space Station, based out of the European Space Agency. Gary Maguire, Senior Geospatial Intelligence Officer in the Department of Premier and Cabinet in the South Australian Government. Naomi Mathers, the Deputy Chair of the Space Industry Association of Australia. Stuart Minchin, the Chief of the Environmental Geosciences Division at Geoscience Australia, and Fabrice Truffaut, Managing Director of Intelligence Australia at Airbus Defence and Space. So I'd like to start by asking the panel to introduce their organisations and also to talk about a key capability that they think that is important for the industries to focus on over the next 10 years. This could be something like data infrastructure or investment, or it could be out to furthering our innovation mindset or changing the way in which we educate both university and high school students. So I might start at this end with Fabrice from Airbus.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fabrice Truffaut. I belong to Airbus Defence and Space, and I'm managing the company established there in Australia since 1988, so nearly 30 years ago. And I will be pleased to share with you, I will say, the French experience in Earth observation in particular, the way we have built also the spatial and space ecosystem in Toulouse in particular. There are plenty of lessons learned. I will never say that we shall do it again on the same way, but this is in particular what is interesting today and what I would like to share with you. There is a very interesting time in Australia. At the moment, the things are evolving very rapidly, and the industry is very interested in that move, in the sense of that we have always, this is in our DNA, we try always to accompany and support the local initiative to grow locally the space and the spatial economy, and this is what we are focused on right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This morning I'm very pleased to be representing the Space Industry Association of Australia, or SIAA, which will be much easier to use for the rest of this session. I completely agree with Phil's comment that behaviourally and operationally in Australia, the space and spatial communities are not as aligned as they need to be. But certainly from the SIAA's point of view, our definition of the space industry is an inclusive one. So not only does it include the full value chain, it's the different environments, the satellite communications, the Earth observation, the positioning, navigation and timing, and other niche areas like space debris tracking. So looking at the sector as a whole. But I do agree that there is an awful lot of work to be done to be able to align a lot of these activities. From an organisation point of view, over the last few years, the SIAA's main activities and focus, first of all, was delivering a white paper, and part of the focus of that white paper was to call for the establishment of a coordinating body to address that very issue. And we were thrilled to have the announcement of the Australian Space Agency on Monday. The other thing that has most definitely absorbed our effort is delivering this Congress. So as the local host of this event, we are very pleased to be able to host this, and this is then an active step towards promoting what Australia's space capability is, encouraging alignment with that. So when we address what we'd like to see, we're certainly seeing very concrete steps taken to achieve that integration, because that then allows us to see the capability in instrumentation and the ground-based infrastructure, and then moving towards seeing real impact through the use of the data and the impact in our industries. And I do believe it's only when we see the linking and the relationship between that we see the economic impact that we're all looking for, and the social impact as well.
My name's Gary Maguire. I work for the Department of Premier Cabinet. I suppose from where I sit is that we've just started up a brand new office called the Office of Data Analytics. We see this as a foundation point, and what's really exciting about this is we legislated this office into our legislation around the Data Sharing Act, which is actually more than just about data sharing internally, about how we actually share data with our non-for-profit sectors, academic sectors, school students and things like that. What's more exciting is that it's about connecting the dots between how government operates, the universities operate, private entities operate, and I think this is an exciting part where if we look at these agencies that are being established, how does South Australia's data platforms actually help share data, create new economies, and also, I suppose from what you're just saying, is connecting up all into the business so it's not just seen as separate entities. More what I've seen over the years, though, as the past president of SSSI, or the Surveying Spatial Science Industry, has been a separation between space and spatial, but in actual fact we're so well connected that we don't actually see that within ourselves. And I think this is an opportunity right now is to grab that and actually join them together. And as Phil articulated, the 2026 agenda is a really, really important tool for us to move forward as a connected society and create public value.
I'm Andrea. So my day job has nothing to do with what we're going to be saying today. One of the biggest side projects, however, that I've been involved in, I've been over in Europe at the Space Agency for a very long time, but one of the big side projects was trying to help back here with, getting the creation of the Australian Space Agency. And it was not, if you were shocked by the announcement, it was definitely not a out of the blue announcement. It's been in the works for a very, very long time. I can briefly just give an overview of the last 10-ish years. There was a group back in 2005 that was an expert reference group which triggered the 2008 Space Senate inquiry, which sort of almost got something up and running, but it was a short-term thing from 2009 to 2013. Then in 2013 we had the National Space Policy released after the initial chapters were designed and approved in 2011. And in 2015 a very, very important legislation change was brought through government for the 1998 Space Activities Act, which is a singular piece of legislation together with a 2001 edition, which is terrible and needed to be changed. And that was done, and that's an extremely, extremely important and great move forward. And then it was brought to Parliament, and there was some background groups that were working very closely with explaining to government what space was, what spatial was, that we do rely on it so much in our everyday lives in Australia. It started with very basic discussions. The first time I was in Parliament I had to explain that satellites were also space, but we got there in the end, and the announcement on Monday was extremely, extremely good. And these expert reference group, as mentioned, will be giving the full details of the agency, etc., by March 2018 when the final report will go out. So it's not an out of the blue thing, it's a massive, really good step for Australia. And the big thing is that we have so many international partners that are willing to work with us, and it's great to see so many here in Adelaide for the conference, and we look forward to being able to leverage those in the future with Australia.
As was mentioned, I'm with Geoscience Australia. Geoscience Australia is the national geoscience agency. We focus on everything from resources, oil and gas, mineral exploration across Australia, through to community safety, tsunami monitoring, earthquake monitoring, and environmental geoscience, which is the area that I look after, which is the earth observation, marine, geospatial information and groundwater research within the Australian government. So the area that I see as a huge opportunity for both the space and spatial sector is actually connecting our information to the social and economic information that governments hold in the traditional kind of statistical domains. We're seeing in the Sustainable Development Goal discussion at a global level that and this is actually pulling together economic, environmental and statistical measures, and there's a real opportunity that exists for us in Australia in integrating our spatial information, our Earth observations with the economic and social information that's held by many different agencies across the Australian government sector to create services, tools and functionality for the Australian public that just doesn't exist at the moment because that data can't be brought together.
All right, thank you, everyone. Now, just as a reminder, please flag down a volunteer if you have questions. While we wait for those to come up, I'll kick things off. So I might start back at the end of the panel with Stuart. As many people in this room are aware, Australia is currently 100% reliant on space assets that are owned by other countries. I just wanted to ask, so I can start with Stuart, but open this up to everybody else on the panel as well. Is this acceptable? And if not, should we be doing something about that?
So, tackling this from an Earth observation perspective, I think that's a really important highlight, and it's from a couple of reasons. One is that the fact that we've been reliant on other countries' assets has actually made us very, very good at making use of all of the assets that are out there. So one of the things I've highlighted in my interactions over the years is that the fact that we haven't had our own satellite, for example, has meant that we have become experts at making use of all of the available platforms out there. And that, whereas many other countries that have got their own horse in the race, so to speak, tend to focus on how they can exploit that horse rather than how they can make use of the whole plethora of horses that are out there. So I think we've got to be careful that we don't view that as a complete negative. It's actually a strength that we have. We've become experts at making use of all of the information out there. Of course, we have to provide value back to the global space community as well. And we try and do that in other ways. Rather than launching our own satellite in the past, we've done that through providing calibration and validation services for other people's missions, by providing downlinks to support the ground segment of other people's operations, and through developing innovations in the application end. So a great example, the DataCube work that's been mentioned, and there was a focus in the last session. That there's an example where our ability to actually focus on how do we make use of this data is providing value back to the global space community that is not about us necessarily having to launch a specific satellite or piece of hardware.
Anyone else want to?
I'd like to follow that up because despite the fact that I would have liked to have seen Australia invest early, it is actually fortuitously we've done it very well, because from an economic point of view we have been able to benefit from the data provided by other countries, and it has driven us to develop that infrastructure. So now when we invest upstream, we should actually be able to realise the return on that investment more readily. We see in other sectors, we've also have capability in the development of upstream assets, and as the price has shifted, as that technology market has shifted, what it will cost Australia to invest in that upstream has now moved. So rather than having large satellites and heritage that we need to maintain and see the return on that investment, we can now invest in some more agile platforms that will complement those existing data streams. We can look at partnering with our international our partners to maybe have an instrument on one of their satellites. So there's a slightly more diverse business model than just having one large Indigenous satellite. So I think with the leveraging the infrastructure, what I would like to see, I think, is where we can learn from the astronomy community. They do have a history of investing quite large amounts of money in instruments. So the current Giant Magellan Telescope instrument will be of the order of about $25 or $30 million. So this is not insignificant. And this is an investment we make in science. I think the same argument can be made in the Earth observation community, where our end users are very specific about what economic impacts can be made in particular industries that then feed back to the specification of an instrument that will have a greater impact along that value, that whole value chain.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. I totally agree that what we can see today, all the digital platforms which are developed in different countries are fully data agnostic. Even the platform we are developing on our side, it has been designed from the beginning to be able to manage all types of data, so that's key. Because all the birds we could have in space are given complementary information and complementary data sets. So we don't have the unique tool serving all the needs. It does not exist. And the reason to have sovereign capabilities, it will give, I would say, a little bit more customization to local need, which is something to be seen. And also, it could also give some guarantee of access to the tools we could have in orbit. But this now is not fully linked to a satellite in particular. It could be brought by some, I would say, contractualization and exclusivity given on a particular amount of resource, which are new models which were not existing in the past when we had only few satellites in orbit. Now we are sending more and more satellites and constellation, which allow the users to have a guarantee of access. So this is also something to be seen. There are also some models where Australia could also decide to manufacture a satellite or part of the satellite being part of a constellation also, which is something which could bring economic development and job creation in Australia.
All right, thank you. So I'll address my next question to Gary. It's been great to see such a focus on Adelaide and South Australia more broadly this week. Are you able to describe a bit more around both the Space Innovation Centre and also the Data Analytics Centre that you talked about, and then explain how they might fit within the 2026 agenda framework?
Yeah, I suppose the thing is, it is exciting to see Adelaide be the focused for change. I think everyone's looking at Melbourne right now for the AFL Grand Final, but we'll get back to this place first. I think what's really important is that the South Australian government is looking at new ways of developing an economy as we move from a manufacturing industry of the past to a new industry of the future, and you're seeing that through the investment around the submarine projects that are going on, but not just in that space. When they look at the space side of things, we've had a long history of companies and players being in South Australia working with the defence sector, and that's really where the document is going to take us to the next step. In that document, it talks about how we're going to integrate from the space side back to the spatial side. So it's a very tactile type of document where you can actually see why the space industry is really important with the spatial industry at the same time. What the other part that's exciting in that document is they picked up on the STEM technology, and that's an important aspect about our next generation of scientists, our next generation of entrepreneurs and innovators. We don't have that component put into that, how do we actually grow the grassroots? And I think that's an important aspect that, this is actually in a document. It's actually in the, we've picked it up in the Agenda 2026 as well. We've also picked it up in our business in the Office of Data Analytics around STEM education. And we're not talking about STEM education from, 16, 17 or 14 or 15. We're actually talking about 3 and 4 year olds. How do we actually educate them very early on the piece around STEM technology and get students excited that there's an amazing career that's going to be in front of them in this sector. So for us, it's actually the starting point, it's the kick-off place, and I think that's an important part where data analytics can start to show the value of using data and technology from observation platforms and other satellites, especially with the AI environments, the IoTs coming through, and we also can see machine learning becoming a real big player, and we're already seeing that from observation data, being pushed through machine learning and creating spatial data, but not for the spatial industry, for the insurance industry, for the health industry. So it's got nothing to do with the spatial industry. It's actually a value proposition to other sectors. So this is an important part for us, and I think South Australia's wanting to drive this part and be the hub, to be the centre of innovation around space and spatial.
And I'll add to that as well. So exactly what Gary said. And in addition, South Australia is also in full partnership developed practical centres for that. So there's a new accelerator coming out in the CBD, specifically for defence, space and spatial small businesses to be able to grow them to medium-sized. And tonight there'll be a dedicated STEM space school opening, which will take middle and high school students and train them even before they get to university in how to have skills for the space sector.
Fantastic. So I'll broaden that topic out to bring up a question from a high school student, Anthony, in the audience, who asks, as a high school student, he'd like to ask the panel to foresee any changes and developments to the high school education system and how that is going to enhance the future of the space and spatial sectors in Australia.
I'll start on that one. I think what you're actually starting to see is that, as an education sector, they're actually looking at the new technologies that are coming on the horizon. They're not talking about what's happening in the next couple of years. They're talking the next 10, 15 years. Documents like the Agenda 2026 is an important document. Having, these abilities to set up space agencies and also hubs are a crucial factor for students, and you're starting to see this now where students in high school are actually going to university and being complemented through what learning opportunities are there. So I think that's the important part, that there's more of a collaboration between state government, university and academia, and getting an early piece for the students to actually understand what career opportunities are in front of them.
I'm going to take that one. I suppose the reason I'm being handed the microphone is in a previous incarnation, I worked at the Victorian Space Science Education Centre. So this is a specialist maths and science centre in Victoria where there's a simulated Mars surface, there's a mission control, and students are applying their fundamental knowledge in a collaborative environment and doing analysis, critical thinking and problem solving. And this is it's wonderful to see this is what's happening in South Australia. It's starting to happen in other states. What we're seeing is the skills that are needed to support the industries of the future. We have that very strong fundamental education system in Australia, but there are constraints with what you can do within a classroom environment. So the curriculum is evolving over time, industry's starting to feed back what their needs are, but the industry is also rapidly evolving. But the message to any student is that, I suppose, the concept of lifelong learning, problem solving, being part of teams, critical thinking. These are all the skills that the jobs that exist now will not look like the jobs that will exist when you graduate. So the more you have that agile learning and that thinking, that's going to help you adapt over time. And that will then make our industries more effective because we will be getting skilled people who can work together. So unless we can actually integrate all those skills, our industries will struggle. So there's what you'll learn at school, and then there's what you will do yourselves and be very proactive and get involved in.
Anyone else? Stuart?
So I just wanted to say I think there's a lot to be said for having a light on the hill, and for it was a long time ago that I was a high school student, and I never imagined that I'd be in this part of the industry. But knowing that there is a pathway there, that we will have a space agency, that we do play in this domain, opens options up and opens people's minds up to different pathways that they might travel after high school, and I think we shouldn't undersell that.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to ignore the questions I've written down because I've got so many here, and pick up. I've got 4 people in here who have asked around what do you think the priorities and activities for the new Space Centre will be. Now, I think that's probably going to be touched on in quite a few panels, so I'm going to take moderator's licence and turn that round and ask you to respond to what you think the Space Agency should not do or should avoid. Maybe taking lessons from other countries, or maybe just taking your experience as to what we think the Space Centre the Space Agency should not be doing. I'm a member of the expert reference group that's deciding this, so I'm speaking as an individual here, not as a member of the expert reference group. I think it's really, and what I have been saying and what I will be saying in that group is that what we must avoid doing is inadvertently duplicating or competing with existing capabilities. As we mentioned earlier, we are heavily reliant on data, on space capabilities from other countries already, and there is little point in us just blindly going along and putting stuff up there that's either in competition or is not adding value to the global system. So I think Australia needs to focus on what are the right niches that we can operate in, and where can we do something that actually adds value to all of our partners in the global space sector, and avoiding situations where we're just doing things to showcase that we can do it, that inadvertently creates a competitive environment or damages our existing relationships, is something to avoid.
Yep, completely concur. So let's not reinvent the wheel. The space industry is very, very established around the world, and Australia is in a great position to leverage international partnerships, which have been offered many, many, many times over the last decades and weren't understood because we didn't necessarily have technical competence because of a lack of space agency in government to be able to understand these and to partner and properly work with them. So yeah, the new agency will have, mandate, authority, technical competence, a multi-year budget, and international partnerships, which will enable Australian industry to flourish, as well as we're not going to be going to Mars or Titan or doing human spaceflight necessarily. We're going to be looking at launches, small sats, and ground stations, and the things that are important to everyday life with the data that we rely on from satellites, as Stuart mentioned.
I really have not much more to add to those 2 comments.
I suppose one comment I will make, and this is actually what we shouldn't do, and that is have a false expectation that to get this right is going to happen really, really quickly. I think we should actually do it right. I think taking the time to understand what we have, what we need, what we can do that's going to have the maximum impact for our industry to get it right for the long term. That's probably the message I would like to see go out, to not put pressure on government, because I don't think we'd like the outcome if we did that.
I think one of the things to avoid is not to create an additional layer in the decision making, but the opposite, having an organization really taking the lead. And the other thing is not having the willingness to reply to all the possible fields, but the opposite, we shall be focused on key fields for the country and put the investment and the lead on this to be sure that we achieve the goals, even if we, later on, year after year, we could enlarge the scope.
All right, no worries. So look, I might continue with these audience questions and merge a couple of them here, which have been addressed to myself, Stuart and Gary, but I'm again going to take license and address it back to Fabrice here. We have some themes here around how the government can better support businesses and better utilise publicly invested infrastructure, both in space infrastructure but also in spatial data infrastructure. So how would you like to see the government better facilitate business within Australia using these infrastructure investments?
That's a key question. The way it has been established in France, for instance, we had funding from the government from the beginning, from the decision to establish the space agency and investing in different fields. And without these initial investment from the government, nothing will happen at the beginning. So it has been the government and the funding from the government has been key from the beginning. And if I am focused on a field that I know a little bit more, Earth observation, this is only last year, after 30 years of satellite fully funded by the French and some other European government, that we have been able to decide to invest on a 100% private manner on the future constellation. So it took a while to have a maturity in this domain, and also to have I would say, enough utilization and enough market to be able to say, okay, we rely on this business, and we have enough users to be able to invest for the future. But it took a year.
Mm-hmm. And anyone else on the panel want to follow up on that topic? Stuart?
Government's very keen to enable value add from the private sector, but it doesn't happen just automatically. So you've got to be deliberate about creating those opportunities. One of the things we're planning on doing with our Digital Earth Australia data cube is to enable a sandpit environment for commercial companies and startups to play with that data and to develop prototype services themselves that we can then they can then potentially spin off as commercial environments. I'll also mention an example from another government, not in Australia, that's doing this, and that is the UK government. Has set up an environment in London called the Geoscience Hub, which is a specific building where they bring startups in to engage with government data in a secure environment to prototype new services that can be generated and to hold their hand, because a lot of startups are not necessarily geospatial experts, they're not necessarily space experts, so they won't naturally just pick up the raw data and deliver services. They've got to be led along that pathway and show how the integration of that data can actually develop services. So there's an incubation role that we need to think about in enabling that take-up by industry. And that's an interesting model that the UK has applied, and you know, I know that there is a lot of thought going into this across government at the moment.
Thanks.
I just want to make one comment, and that is with this, I suppose, incubation period, to start changing the culture within state and federal governments to buy Australian, to actually take the risk and build the relationships to buy these products, use these.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other part about, you know, when you articulate a strategy or a document, it's really important to actually back the investors in that space, especially the small to medium enterprise, because that's where innovation comes from. And certainly here in South Australia, that's been a key focus on that small to medium investment area. Like, you know, South Australia being, you know, one of the first places with a gig hub, you know, in creating these areas of, you know, like high capacity broadband access for startups to actually work within. That's something usually that's a blocker about getting high high-volume data sets. I think Stuart said earlier today, in the earlier presentation around, petabytes of data lying around the place. How do you actually use that data if you don't have access to it? And I think, governments really need to look at that, and how do they actually provide the foundation, the infrastructure in place so these companies can actually start investing, start building their space to move on into more of a mainstream production space. So I think it's important to have these documents. It's important for government to get the right mix between government, academia, and also private sector. It is not going to happen just by one agency, one authority or one agency doing all the work. It's actually a collaboration between all parties.
Okay.
There are also some new model to be investigated. Like I was thinking about the public-private partnerships, bringing together industry and public organization, which could also make the decision easier to initiate the programs.
Yeah, so that actually flows perfectly into the next question. So someone's picked up on my comment about that OECD study earlier about how Australia has the lowest rate of interaction between private business and universities. So to further build on those stats, the OECD average is around about 35% of companies have some interaction with universities when it comes to developing new products and services. It maxes out at about 70%, so I think it's in Iceland that about 70% of companies interact with universities. In Australia, it's at 5%. So what is it that Australian industry can do? And this isn't a role for one of government or industry or academia. What is it that we can do to improve this, and what actions can we take? Just solve Australia's problems on this stage, if you would.
So actually, we did discuss this at one of the universities here last night, that they are looking a lot more. They have a whole industry centre. That there's a change in the universities, that they do understand this, and they're creating industry centres and sending out their students not just on self-done placements, but creating, at least for engineering, they're creating direct links with industry where there's dedicated times through the year that companies will take engineers on site. And you need the patience from the companies as well to be able to have sort of trainees around the place and have the time invested in that. But it creates the links, and then, you get the conversations happening about, oh, hey, we're researching this, and oh, that's great because we were trying to advance this particular thing, and just getting the knowledge. I mean, even in your own companies and buildings and whatever, half the time you don't know what people are researching 2 doors down. But getting that sort of dialogue going, you'll get the snowball effect from there. Yeah.
So I think the CRC model is a very good start, and we've seen the Cooperative Research Centre for Spatial Information and the Space Environment Research Centre both make a valuable contribution to bringing industry and academia together that have positive outcomes for both. The university is able to continue their research, which is their core business, and industry gets tangible outcomes. And until there's an environment where both communities actually get tangible outcomes that further that industry, there's no motivation for these groups to come together or to change their behaviour. So the more that we encourage these types of investment and platforms, I think we'll see better statistics from the OECD.
Anyone else? No? Okay. So I might have to make this one the last question, unfortunately. We have more questions here than we can answer. But this one's back to Andrea and Naomi here, but also open to the rest of the panel. So you spoke earlier about the advantages of using data from other countries' satellites, and Stuart did as well. But with the cost of satellite development falling, is there an opportunity to divert some of the money spent on overseas data and support the Australian startup satellite companies? And should this be part of the 2026 agenda?
Yes. Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. You can do both. So yeah, absolutely have internal satellite development. It's, from an overseas perspective, it's really quite bizarre that we haven't had this earlier, to be honest, because in Europe and in America, 10-year-olds build their own satellites and throw them up, and it's a really rapid, like 3-month development, $100,000 kind of thing, US dollar, sorry, and that it's such a foreign, novel, amazing new thing is a bit weird, and I think we should absolutely have the small satellite community doing things, as well as having, we don't need to reinvent the wheel on the big satellites, and we have the opportunities to leverage partnerships and to use existing satellite constellations for the big ones, as well as building our own small ones and have secured access across both.
Anyone else?
It's happening. The fact that Fleet has investment, it means that they had a defined application that was going to solve a problem and they received investment. When there's a very clear use that's not being served by existing data, there will be a case for investment. The same case needs to be made to the government as well as to a venture capital investor. The government won't invest either unless there's a clear gap in the market. So the better we get, the more sophisticated we are about that. The reason the government invested, was it $8 billion in the NBN satellites, was because there was a clear need to solve that part of the problem with an investment in infrastructure.
And actually Blackbird VCs that made those investments in Fleet and Gilmore are in the room today and attending the conference. So I think that shows you the level of understanding and the level of commitment that Australia is going to bring in the future and has already done.
Yeah, this question actually came from Blackbird, so that's interesting. And Stuart?
Thanks, Rick.
And just on final, I guess, point around this, which is that it's exciting that there's all this new opportunity to launch new, cheaper platforms. We mustn't forget, though, that often if you're going to get investment from the private sector in developing services, you need certainty that that service is going to be there for a long time. If you're going to make an investment in developing an application, you need to have time to pay back that investment, and that means that that data feed needs to be there in an ongoing operational sense for a long period of time. So we've got to be careful we don't get too excited about throwing lots of interesting new things up there without actually looking after the workhorses that are actually going to give us the data feeds in the long term that people can actually build businesses from. Otherwise, the economic value will not flow from the investment in space.
Excellent. Well, yes, unfortunately we are out of time. However, I will make these questions available to the panel members for their consideration. I and maybe some of the other people here will be available to answer some more questions down the front here after we wind up. So yes, look, it's great to see that the barriers and separation between the space and spatial sectors are starting to dissolve. We really want to make sure that the voice of the end user in our growth sectors makes it all the way through to the start of the satellite development cycle. And I think a lot of the developments and conversations that we've seen at this conference really show that the future is quite bright for us, but it's not just going to happen on its own. We really all need to take ownership of that change. So with that, I'd like to thank you for being a fantastic audience with some great questions, and ask you to thank the panel members here for their time and contributions.